As you know, on Sunday night or Monday morning of every week, we post a new expository semiotics explaining why we would choose which lectionary readings. But in these readings, our dream is, and our desire is, to help you read the signs and fondle the details and spot the seminal metaphors, the condensed signs and the stories that are key for preaching to a digital culture. So strap on your seatbelt and join us as we prospect our passages for today.
It's the fifth Sunday after Pentecost. This is blog number 67. Can you believe I've done 67 of these? It's hard for me to realize. Our lectionary passages are some great ones, some diverse ones, but with a common thread, a common theme. First of all, we begin at the book of Lamentations. Lamentations, the third chapter, 22 to 33. And in many ways, Psalm 30 is a similar lamentation where God brings us out of the pit, and we are celebrating that weeping may linger for a night, but this great phrase, joy comes in the morning. But I want to just pause at that Lamentations for a moment, because some of us forget that there is a book of Lamentations in the Bible for a reason. There is a time to lament, and some of us don't want to stop at the lament and mourn stage. We just want to go right to let's celebrate life. And so our funerals even have become all about celebrations of life. Well, I do want to celebrate life. It's a witness to the resurrection. But at the same time, there is a time to mourn. There's a time to lament. There's a time just to pause and think about what the loss is and how significant that loss is before we go on to witness to the power of the resurrection. And in this book of Lamentations is one of the most beautiful phrases in all the Bible. It talks about how God's mercies, you ready, are fresh every morning. I once did a little series just called Fresh Every Morning, series of meditations, just how God's mercies are fresh every morning. Jesus is the bread of life. But it's not 2,000-year-old bread. You got to bake fresh bread. And so the bread that is broken for us is bread that is baked, fresh baked, right out of the oven, fresh every morning. And that's how we ought to look at each new day. Every day, God's mercies are what? Fresh every morning. I love that phrase. The 2 Samuel 1:1, and then you go to 17 to 27, is a very, and I was tempted to spend the whole time just on this one passage, but I've spent a lot just on First Testament text, so I want to just hit on this one briefly. But it is such a profound one and such a provocative one that it's worthy of pausing here for more than just a moment. You remember the story, you may remember the story that Saul has died and Jonathan has been slain. Now, David and Jonathan are warrior buddies. There's nothing tighter than warrior buddies in battle. In fact, they tell us that when people are on the front lines, what are they dying for? They're no longer dying for great causes and even great countries. They're now dying for each other because they're dying for their buddies. And so we have here a lament of David over Jonathan's death, and even honoring Saul, who's been after him and was the cause of all of his problems and was sought to kill him. But even Saul is honored because he is Jonathan's father. There is here a call to remember and to teach all generations what is called. This is the Song of the Bow. The Song of the Bow. And there's been a lot of debate about what this is, the Song of the Bow. It begins, the Song of the Bow begins with how the mighty have fallen. In the middle of it is how the mighty have fallen. And then the end of it is how the mighty have fallen. And what can be the meaning of this? Now, there's a lot. Some scholars just say, no, it's really not so much a song of the bow. It's you teach all future generations of Hebrews to use the bow. It's not just the sword that's going to win battles. It's the bow and arrow. And so you've got to teach them use the arrow. But I think it's more than that. The song is in his honor. Jonathan was associated with the arrow and being a wonderful master of the bow and arrow. And there is a tradition. I mean, here that both Jonathan and Saul were slain by the arrow. But I think there's more going here than just honoring here of Jonathan and Saul. David is saying, teach Israel a song. Teach Israel to not just to imitate Jonathan the archer and that whole tradition, but and not just to praise Jonathan's use of the bow by the song, and not just to teach Israel the craft of bowmanship, of archery. It's so much more than that. To draw the string, okay, is to sing the song of the bow. And the song of the bow is, again, how the mighty have fallen, how the mighty have fallen, how the mighty have fallen. Now, where have we heard this before? Hannah's song. Where will we hear this later? Mary's song, the Magnificat. And I think, God has swept the mighty from their seats and from their positions and from their thrones, and how the mighty have fallen. And part of this is to remember that what brings the mighty down is not to wield the sword, but to sing the song of God's shield and sword of the Spirit. The bow is a symbol of strength, but whose strength is it? Our strength is in the Lord. And the ultimate strength is not in the swords, the shields, and the archery. The ultimate strength, what really brings the mighty from their high perches and high pillars and high horses, what brings them down is our strength is in the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And that is, I think, you hear the echoes of Hannah's song, you hear the future resonances of Mary's Magnificat. That's the song of the bow, to remember, to teach all generations of Israelites that our strength is not in our weapons. Our strength is in the song of the bow and the sword of the Spirit. So we have here then the wonderful text, the wonderful reading passage that from Mark 5:21 to 43. And what I'm going to do is I got to read this. I'm going to read it briefly, but it's all right here. And we have here the story of Jairus' daughter. But in the middle of it is called a sandwich story, because Jesus can do this. There's one story, and then you get another story in the middle of that larger story, and then you go back to the story again. That's what happens here. And so let me read it to you about both. It's two daughter stories, really. Jairus' daughter, and then Jesus' daughter. We'll come to that in a minute. When Jesus had again crossed over by the boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman who was there, who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him. Right? She's skulking up behind him. And in the crowd, touched his cloak. Because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, the bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. So what comes next? And once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. Now the Greek here is dunamis. Some want to translate it virtue. The virtue had gone out of him. But really, the Greek clearly here is dunamis, that power, dunamis. Power had gone out from him. Of course, this here is healing power. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. It was me. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they had said, Jesus told them, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and he said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead but asleep." But they laughed at him. Never get laughed at. They laughed at Jesus. After he put them all out, after laughing at him, I would have put them all out too. More than that, maybe. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. And at this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to tell anyone about this and told them, "Give her something to eat." There's so much here. There's so much here. These are two daughter stories because one is Jairus' daughter, who is 12 years old. Now, wait a minute. How long had the woman that Jesus calls daughter, how long had she been suffering from this issue of blood? 12 years. Now, I don't think anybody yet has adequately explained why the double 12. Numbers have significance in Scripture. This is a culture where numbers are extremely important. They're really, in many ways, metaphors for something larger. I think we still have not figured out what this 12. The 12, the daughter of Jairus is at an age where she herself would begin, perhaps, with an issue of blood as she becomes a woman. And here was a woman who 12 years had been in this condition of womanhood, if you will. I don't know if it has something to do with that, but just let's suspend something here. This 12 is significant, very significant. The other thing here that is hugely significant is that this hemorrhaging woman is the only person, living person, even though she does not have a name, that Jesus calls daughter. There's only one person in all of the Gospels that Jesus says, daughter. There's a companion story about the only person in all of the Gospels that Jesus called son. And in many ways, they're very similar stories. This hemorrhaging woman for 12 years had spent everything that she had because she is unclean. The code is clear. Leviticus 10, Leviticus 15, 22, 23. Anybody that is in this state is unclean, and you cannot come there. They can't be at your table. You have to isolate yourself from them. Even the furniture that they use, because they've sat on it or used it or touched it, makes that furniture unclean. You can't use it either. So here's a woman who's been totally alone and in isolation for 12 years, abandoned by everybody around her, basically a living leper, another kind of leper, not the skin disease, but another kind of, she is impure and nobody can come near her. And she's been isolated, alone, desperate for help and healing. The other story where Jesus calls the person son is a similar story. He has been abandoned by his parents. He is a paralyzed man. He lives on a cot. The responsibility of the first century of taking care of disabled children is the father. But sometimes the fathers, who are kings of their own kingdom, every little extended family is a little kingdom, like a little nation. And the father is the king, and he can decide what happens. And sometimes they just couldn't take care of whatever reason, and they would abandon at a distance. They just drop off the paralyzed son or daughter, whatever, and they just would hightail it back home and tell a story of what happened or something. So here is an abandoned person, a paralytic, and then find some people, we don't know who they were, that show enough compassion. There were more than four. It says the pallet was carried by four of them, so we know there's more than four. And as they raise the roof right off of Jesus's house, it's his house, read the text carefully. They're raising the roof, R-A-Z-I-N-G, and also R-A-I-S, raising the roof. As he's preaching, and can you imagine the roof's coming down and being destroyed right in front of him, and they drop the pallet of this paralytic right in front of him. And the first thing that he hears is not "you're healed." The first thing he hears is a word that he never thought he would hear from anybody else in his whole life again. And he hears Jesus call him son. He has a father. Somebody cares enough for him to call him son. Before physical healing, there is relational healing. And the same thing here, the hemorrhaging woman. Before she even understands what is happening, he says, daughter. So we have two daughter stories. She tells him the truth. And I'm the one that touched you. And I'm the one that received your healing power. And he says, daughter. Oh, what that must have been like to her, who's been rejected by her family and isolated and ostracized from them, an outcast, an outlander, an outlaw, if you will. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Two daughter stories. A daughter, Jairus' daughter, ready for her womanhood and is now brought back to life. Notice, and then the hemorrhaging woman for 12 years cannot escape that womanhood, that issue of constant bleeding, and is also brought back to life, and both brought back to community, as the paralytic is told when he is healed. Take up your mat and go home. Go home. Go home to those very people that abandoned you and isolated you. And the hemorrhaging one, be freed from your suffering. Go home, back to your family. You're whole now. You're free from this isolation and ostracizement. The one last thing, there's so much here, we could go on and on, but let me just say one last thing I love about this story. When Jesus heals Jairus' daughter, let me read again. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. In other words, keep family secrets. Okay? Family secrets you keep them. But then he says, and told them, give her something to eat. Okay? It's not just that Jesus is a foodie. He's always thinking about food, right? Remember? There's a fasting time, but now is feasting time. The Messiah's here, the bridegroom's come. You don't fast at a wedding feast. You feast at a wedding feast. So it's time to eat. It's time to. But this is another kind of resurrection story where Jairus' daughter is resurrected, but immediately goes. This is the resurrection that will lead us to the marriage of the Lamb, the feast of the Lamb, the eternal messianic banquet. And so, in some way, what they are doing is to celebrate this time of resurrection and this time of heavenly feasting and celebrating that will come one day when the kingdom of God is on earth as it is in heaven. Two daughter stories, one within the other. And then the two stories where Jesus refers to only time one person is son, the paralytic, only time one person is daughter, the woman with the issue of blood.
Semiotics is the art of angling, of turning things askew, upside down, inside out, cattywampus, sunny side up, over easy, scrambled, hard-boiled. We hope you enjoyed today's journey, but always remember, it's more important you prepare the preacher than you prepare the sermon.